Thank you again for joining us for Contemporary Asian Stories, How Bruce Lee Became a Legend with UBC professor Christopher Wray.
I think the story of kind of how Bruce Lee became Bruce Lee is a really, really interesting one. And one thing that I've discovered when kind of talking about Bruce Lee, I've taught him in a couple of UBC courses. This is coming live from the UBC campus tonight. Some people have heard of Bruce Lee, but actually haven't seen his films. So one of the first questions that I have for you is, which Bruce Lee films have you seen? And, or have you just heard of the guy? And do you have how has your opinion about Bruce Lee been formed? So I'm assuming that if you're here tonight, you've heard of him. You are partly attracted by his image, by his celebrity, but are kind of wondering, why is Bruce Lee still important so many years after his death? So we're going to talk about a few different things, but focusing on kind of reception history. So we'll talk a bit about Bruce Lee himself, but I think especially about how he's resonated with a variety of different people and how he went from kind of being an ordinary person, albeit from a showbiz family, right? His family did have appearances on screen for many, many years. He supposedly made his own first screen debut as an infant, right? But as an adult, he was this larger than life presence. And a lot of people really identified with what they saw in his films. So we'll start with kind of identification. And I wanted to talk about this history kind of through a few films, including this documentary, I Am Bruce Lee. But then turn from this question of identification, right? We have a lot of evidence that people really identify with the figure and the aura surrounding him. Look briefly at some of his works. So kind of cover some of the bases of, well, what were his films, right? What is the legacy that he has left behind? What is the textual foundation for the legend, you could say? And I want to also draw a contrast when we're talking about him acting, to talk about how he innovated this form of the Kung Fu film or the martial arts film by comparing some of his works to what came right before. And then for audience, I think that kind of his legendary status is really due to the audience reaction to him. And I want to highlight one community in particular, which is the African-American community, because this is a community that I think has had an outsized influence on turning Bruce Lee from just another Kung Fu or martial arts screen star into a legend. And so I thought we could look at some clips from some of his films, as well as films that he inspired, right? Things that are kind of downstream within this cultural production sphere. And then I think there have been some afterlives, right? Some very degraded copies of Bruce Lee that we've seen, but also works that deal with the legend and deal how legends can kind of grow stale and become cliche as they're recycled, but they can also be renewed in really interesting ways. So I think the basic question we're dealing with tonight is what made Bruce Lee any different from anybody else, right? If you look at the history of Chinese cinema, and I'm very, very interested in Chinese film history, right? China's had films since the 1890s. The first so-called Chinese-made film was from 1905. It's called Ding Jun Shan, or Conquering Jun Mountain. And it is known as an opera film. It was a stage performance by a well-known Chinese opera or Peking opera star. But actually, since it was a silent film, we don't hear any singing in this film. And the evidence that's been left behind suggests that what we do see is fighting. So one of the very first Chinese films was actually a fighting film. And then we had this huge wave of martial arts films in the 1920s, and then just generation after generation, before you get to the late 60s and early 70s, the 1971 in particular, when Bruce Lee burst onto the scene. So I think this question could be asked about the man, about the actor, about his films, and about his kind of iconic status while still alive, and then the legendary status he has kind of achieved posthumously. So here are the films, right? These are the films that we know of. The Big Boss is also known as The Chinese Connection. Then there's Fist of Fury. There's, I think Big Boss is sometimes also known as Fists of Fury, which is extremely confusing. There's a lot of confusing play with the titles here. Enter the Dragon. Before that, The Way of the Dragon, which is significant as a film that Bruce Lee wrote, directed, and starred in himself. And then there's Game of Death, which was completed after his death, right? So that's not a lot of films. And so let me just raise that question I put to you again. Which of these have you seen? If you could just write in the chat, then other people watching tonight will get a sense of what are our frames of reference, kind of what are the touchstones? What are the films that we've seen? So just take a moment to write that in. I'm going to keep talking. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 films, right? Jackie Chan, right, another iconic martial arts hero of the screen, has acted in over 120 films. He's directed a bunch, but you think about just the production, like the sheer volume of text created, right? The sheer volume of images created. The fact that Bruce Lee could produce so little but become such a huge star really says something. And I think that is the first way that I would say that Bruce Lee is different from a lot of the other people who preceded and followed him. Is he didn't produce very much. And so we have a very small canon of Bruce Lee works to work with and to form our opinions of. And so Bruce Lee himself, he did some interviews, right? We have a lot of things outside the films to draw on. He did a little bit of writing. He gave, interviews again and again. But there are a lot of people who speak for Bruce Lee, and I'm of course one of them as well, right? I'm saying things about Bruce Lee, but I thought we could start by taking a look at a clip from this documentary, which was made and kind of approved by Bruce Lee's family and descendants, and see what some of the fans say. So this is how the film starts. So Kenny, could you play this first clip from I Am Bruce Lee? And we are going to, for every clip, we're going to...
Bruce Lee is a worldwide fighting icon.
He was a 130-something pound lethal weapon.
Bruce and his fighting style changed the game.
In the beginning, I had no intention that what I was practicing and what I'm still practicing now would lead to this.
Bruce Lee, Bob Dylan, Ali, Jay-Z, Tiger, Kobe, Jordan, they all had the same spirit.
No stunt coordinator coordinated his shit. He did it himself.
The guy you see in Bruce's films is the way Bruce was in person.
He could lose his temper.
Bruce Lee is my idol.
He was directing, writing, acting.
I don't even look at him as being Asian. He's like Bruce Lee. He's like my idol.
When you think of Bruce Lee, you don't think about the Asian karate guy. You think about a legacy.
The moves that he could do, when you were wondering if they were speeding up the camera.
Bruce Lee was like the superhero of the Asian community.
You had Muhammad Ali. You had Malcolm X. Bruce Lee represented that same kind of radicalism.
Technically brilliant choreography. You get mysticism, you get hyper-masculinity. This guy is like, bang.
He's putting balls on Chinese men.
That's some cool stuff right there.
You're like, wow, that super cool guy is my dad.
And there'll never be another Bruce Lee.
Baby, here I am, man. How does a small Chinese guy become the greatest martial artist of all time?
Production 263-05-224-10, test X1. Take one.
Now, Bruce, just look right into the camera lens right here and tell us your name, your age, and where you were born.
My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee. I was born in San Francisco in 1940. I'm 24 right now.
So I think this is a fantastic documentary. I really learned a lot from it, and it brings together, quite a lot. And I think you get a sense even from these first few minutes that Bruce Lee is presented as kind of the total package, right? He's both Asian, but he also kind of transcends Asianness. he's got that swagger that comes across in even just a few split seconds, right? And, all these people are kind of testifying what Bruce Lee means to them. It does show that Bruce Lee really connected, right? He connected with a lot of people. So I want to kind of delve a little bit into this. I'm not going to spend too much time on biography. You can kind of look this up on the internet. There have been biographies written about the man himself. But I think just a few touch points here, right? He was born in the US, so he's American. He was raised in Hong Kong, so he has a very strong Hong Kong connection, right? He's bilingual. He began his acting career very young. Some people don't know that he was kind of a child actor as well. But he moved to the United States as a teenager and attended the University of Washington. And, part of the story is that he was getting in a lot of street fights. And, if you fight the wrong person or connected with a triad, you may end up dead. So best to move to a safer place like Seattle. So he moves to Seattle. He majors in drama at the University of Washington. Sometimes he would claim that he majored in philosophy, but that's not what UW tells us. But he, soon after graduation, or he met his wife there, but soon after graduation, he got involved in television and appeared in a couple of TV shows. And I'll talk about those in a minute, but his career was quite short from, he had his childhood career, but his kind of adult career was relatively short, right? Ending with his death in Hong Kong in 1973. So the Lee family is quite small, and there was also a tragedy, and his son, Brandon Lee, also died in the midst of shooting a movie. So he himself became a movie star, but like his father, died, and under rather mysterious circumstances. He was supposedly shot while on set of The Crow. And so this movie was released after his death. You had a kind of body double appearing in some scenes, and it seemed uncannily similar to what had happened with Bruce Lee, right? Who was shooting a movie, and then we have this unfinished movie with a body double in it. And his family is absolutely sick of answering questions about, like, is there some family curse? But whatever the facts may be, this does contribute to this kind of aura and this legend surrounding the figure. But if you look at his actual activities in life, right, he founded martial arts schools. And one of the things that he preached, right, he was known for being affiliated with one school and kind of developing a school of martial arts, but that this was one that was very eclectic and drew on many different traditions. And so he said, I really don't believe in there being one style. Like, you should take the best from everything, right? Whatever works is what's important. In the late 1960s, he became a TV actor, so that screen test that we just saw at the end of the documentary clip was from Charlie Chan's Number One Son. And if like me, you watch old films, you'll know that Charlie Chan was this kind of Pulp Fiction Chinese detective figure who, was in pulp literature. There were films with like whiteface actors. And then you had Key Luke appearing as the Number One Son. I don't think this particular show was produced, but the breakthrough role on TV that helped lead to this later film career was Kato in The Green Hornet. So he's kind of the sidekick figure. But and this was just, I think it only had one season or something, so it was not very prolific output either. But what Bruce Lee found when he went to Hong Kong is that everybody thought that the show was about Kato in Hong Kong, not about the Green Hornet. His figure completely upstaged the star and the titular hero of this series. And so this was kind of his entryway to working with producers and major filmmakers. So 1971, we have the first Bruce Lee film, right? And this was an overnight sensation. If you look at all the 5 films that I mentioned earlier, and you just look at the money side, they were phenomenally profitable films. And so I think one of the reasons there's been so much interest in Bruce Lee from the beginning is because he made a lot of people a lot of money, right? He didn't make himself very much money for The Big Boss. I think his paycheck was rather small for that. But by the time you get to The Way of the Dragon, right, he's got a lot more artistic control. He doesn't have to deal with some of those big personalities from the Hong Kong industry and the like. And he's, again, putting in more choreography. But he had really established himself immediately as a bankable star. So his charisma, his martial arts skill, and his comedy and dramatic skill. If you're interested in his comic side, The Way of the Dragon is a very good one to check out. There's a lot of gags in there. But he made a ton of money and made a ton of money for a lot of people. I mentioned that one of the things that I think contributes to his legend is, of course, the film texts themselves. And if you look at films like Fist of Fury or Enter the Dragon, there are some things that are not necessarily connected to Bruce Lee himself. Some of the cinematography, the camera angles, the way that the shots are framed, the kind of props like the use of mirrors is absolutely fantastic. And it kind of complements the bodily performance that Bruce Lee put forward. So I think that, I'm not going to say too much about the filmic quality of his works, since we're focused on the man and his audience. But I do think that that's an important part of the story and kind of this legendary status, and that you see people again and again trying to recreate iconic scenes from the film, including the poses, right? So you saw that even in that 2012 documentary of people like doing the same pose or kicking towards the camera in exactly the same way, that this is a larger than life figure, even though he was only 135 pounds, right? This is a short, lightweight, but you look at his body and you realize he is a force to be reckoned with. So Bruce Lee is, of course, as I mentioned before, not the inventor of Kung Fu cinema, but I wanted to look at an example of how he really changed the look and feel of it. So just to give an example of how he's part of a lineage, if you just look at the Chinese title of a film from 1970 starring Wang Yu, right, the Chinese boxer. So Wang Yu was an established star who had appeared in a bunch of Shaw Brothers martial arts films. Then we have Enter the Dragon a few years later. And the title in Chinese is very, very similar, right? There's only one character of difference. So let's take a look at The One-Armed Swordsman. This is a huge box office smash in 1967 in Hong Kong. It made a ton of money. It was mostly shot on a studio set, lush color, lush cinematography, and a lot of gimmicks as well, a lot of gimmick weapons and the like, and the gimmick of having the swordsman fighting with only one arm. So let's take a look at this film and get a sense of what it was like. So it's a very, very short clip, right? We don't get the major fight scenes or the chopping off of the arm. This is the magic palm sequence, right? And you can already get a sense of, right, there's some humor, you have these kind of charismatic leads, a lot of medium close-ups and the like, and also supernatural stuff going on. So there is a certain degree of fakeness to the sets and to some of the stunts that you see going on here. Whereas for Bruce Lee, one of the things that he really embodied was this kind of authentic physicality, that he really was in great shape. And I think this was part of the model that he changed, is that we're no longer satisfied with camera tricks and supernatural stuff. Like, we want people who are actually can throw a punch and take a punch. And so Jackie Chan, I think, is following in this vein. He also got a start in the 1970s, so he became a star then. And so one of the things that Jackie Chan and his publicity team keep emphasizing is that he really does his own stunts. And this is one of the reasons we should watch him, right? Because there's nothing fake going on here. So there's a real bodily commitment there. Let's take a look at, just for sake of contrast, a very interesting moment. So this is the beginning of Game of Death. But the Game of Death begins in a very bizarre way with a clip from Way of the Dragon. And so we're going to see how they integrate it in, but it'll give you a sense of the Bruce Lee style fighting. So we're just going to take a clip from his showdown with Chuck Norris. So again, I was showing this clip for the 2-in-1 element that we get, right? We get 2 films in one. You can tell which are the versions from Way of the Dragon and then the shots of the film crew shooting that scene. There's like a self-referential quality. And so in Game of Death, you have this very bizarre structure where it begins with footage of the actual Bruce Lee. It ends with several scenes of the actual Bruce Lee. But in between, we have like a fake Bruce Lee or a Bruce Lee imitator or body double for most of the scenes. And so I feel like even within this, you have, within a Bruce Lee film, you have both Bruce Lee, the authentic Bruce Lee, and you have imitation Bruce Lee, kind of the emulation of Bruce Lee going on at the same time. And so this, I think we have fandom being represented in Bruce Lee films in really interesting ways. And I'll give a few more examples in a minute. So what is the difference between, say, a Wang Yu type character and the Bruce Lee type character? It's been summed up often as being that Wang Yu was an actor who played a martial arts expert, whereas Bruce Lee was an actual martial arts expert who acted. Right, and so this was kind of a fundamental difference between the two styles. And this has been followed, I think, on the Chinese silver screen with figures like Jackie Chan, of course, Jet Li, right? He actually was a martial arts champion in China before turning his career towards filmmaking. Another thing that we get in Bruce Lee films that I think has added to his aura is that the bodily fighting and the training and the self-conditioning is often talked about as being a philosophy, right? Or exuding a philosophy. And so in Enter the Dragon, for example, there is one sequence where he's dealing with a bully on a boat. They're all going to be contestants at a martial arts competition on an island off of Hong Kong. And this guy keeps trying to pick a fight with him, this racist white guy, and threatening him by pretending to punch him. And so Bruce Lee is eventually, okay, fine, let's spar. But why don't we do it on the boat? That little boat dragged behind this one because there's not enough room. And so why don't you go down first? The white guy goes down first, and then Bruce Lee does not follow. He just lets out the line. So the guy's in this leaky boat, right? The art of fighting without fighting. And this is a kind of principle drawn from the art of war, right? That is the best way to win a battle, is to not have to throw a punch. And so Bruce Lee, when he kind of talked about his own work, would often speak in these terms. And the ideas are not necessarily original, but the expression of them often was in his films. And he often talked about martial arts itself as the ultimate form of self-expression. And that's why he was so into it, right? It was not about punches and kicks, and it was not about styles, but it was about finding your authentic self and expressing it. So one of the ways he expressed it, which you heard in that clip from The Game of Death, was through screams, right? These kind of primal screams. So it wasn't just the body, you also have the voice. And I think this is particularly important, sometimes overlooked, but one of the things that all Bruce Lee fans will do, right? Little boys, teenagers, grown men, gals as well, is like, you can mimic him. You don't know Chinese, or maybe you don't want to imitate his accent, but you can do the scream, right? You can strike the pose. So you got a lot of people identifying and emulating through the screams, And again, there's this bodily commitment. So in a lot of the plots of these films, he takes a beating, and at the end of Fist of Fury, right, he makes the ultimate sacrifice, right, leaping towards the camera. So it's a very famous shot in the film. So now I want to move to kind of the real meat and focus of today's talk, which is about one community that I think played a huge role in shaping the legend, and this is African Americans. So you'll have seen in what we just saw in that documentary that many of the people testifying are African Americans from a variety of backgrounds, right? We have mixed martial artists, and there's a lot of talk in this documentary about, did Bruce Lee found mixed martial arts? Well, no, he didn't, but he was very influential and he inspired a lot of people in that his own fighting style was very eclectic. So whatever works in the ring, whatever works in battle, that's what you do. We have athletes, right? So Kobe Bryant, the late great Kobe Bryant was mentioned, makes a brief appearance. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as we'll see, was very important and actually appears in Bruce Lee's final film as an antagonist. But if you look at through a bunch of other pop culture texts, right? Eddie Murphy, I grew up with Eddie Murphy, right? A hilarious comedian, well known from Saturday Night Live, and where he appears as essentially a Bruce Lee figure in Kung Fu Christmas, that kind of a skit. Or people now may be more familiar with Chris Tucker, who plays essentially a Bruce Lee fan who is a only somewhat competent cop who is paired with a real martial arts expert, right? Jackie Chan's characters in the Rush Hour films. And so Chris Tucker's character is constantly like doing the Bruce Lee screens and striking the poses, and occasionally actually kicks butt too. 1974, so this is 1 year after Bruce Lee died. We have songs like Kung Fu Fighting, right? Still played when I was in college. And a very catchy song. And I mentioned screaming before. I think one of the things that we could do to try to understand the Bruce Lee stardom, particularly in the African-American community, is to look at him within a genealogy. And I've just mentioned a couple obvious examples. Like one of the things that makes James Brown's sound so distinctive is this kind of almost involuntary, like rhythmic, screams and grunts and calls out. And of course, Michael Jackson, right? You listen to any of his songs, there's like that yelping is one of the appeals, like one of the things that makes him distinctive. And so I would really put Bruce Lee within that kind of genealogy. That I think there was a tradition that he could be brought into by the audience. So if you actually look at like what was going on in the United States around the time that Bruce Lee became a star, there's some very interesting contexts. So in 1967, African Americans were only about 11% of the population, but they were a full quarter of the movie-going audience. So they had some economic power. And there's one source that I'm going to draw on a bit tonight about Black audiences and Kung Fu films that mentions that this was a key constituent. This was like a key market that helped to keep the Kung Fu craze alive for a long time. This was also a population that was under a lot of pressure, right? Lyndon Johnson's, new laws, civil rights laws and the like were only just starting to come into effect. But in the late 60s, things are still looking pretty grim, right? There's a lot of overt racism, and we have the Vietnam War going on. Black people, African Americans, are disproportionately being conscripted into the military, fighting and dying overseas against the yellow man, right? As mentioned in that Bruce Springsteen song, Born in the USA. And so there's a sense that this is a community under threat that has been pushed to the brink so much that they essentially need to take up arms to protect themselves. So there's this one group, represented by, say, the Black Panther Party in Oakland, where Bruce Lee had a dojo, essentially, that wanted to take up arms to protect their community. And then you also have people trying to do nonviolent resistance to oppression. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And one of the resonances that African Americans found and have testified to again and again about figures like Bruce Lee is that we are fellow underdogs of color, right, who are suffering oppression from essentially white imperialists and white people of power. And so if you look at the volume of civil unrest going on in the United States in the years leading up to Bruce Lee's films, you can it helps to understand. It helps you to understand what was going on for this audience. And so, but it wasn't just a repression as the government response. You actually also did have policies that tried to promote better economic well-being for African Americans. And so if you look at the median income of African Americans in the decade kind of leading up to Bruce Lee's, I guess, kind of the latter part of his career, there was a significant increase in median income. So African Americans become more and more important as consumers, especially of things like, things that requiring disposable income, like going to the movies. So you have films that dramatize this, right? We have the small Bruce Lee character fighting against a white giant, and before and after, right? He always takes them down dramatically. In Game of Death, we also have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar appearing, and there are a lot of publicity photos showing just how high Bruce Lee has to jump in order to connect with his adversary. But they were good friends off screen. That Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a student of Bruce Lee's, right? He studied martial arts with him. And so I feel like what is going on here is this is partly a nod to this community with which Bruce Lee had a very strong connection and a personal connection, right? One of the things that he did at his martial arts school was he would teach anyone, no matter what their race was, no matter what walk of life. This was not something he treated as like martial arts as like a proprietary Chinese only thing, which was how some of his competitors did view this. So he was very welcoming. Let's take a look at the moment in Game of Death, right? I think the part of the film that is the most interesting, but we're only going to watch a very short part of the fight scene where Bruce Lee has essentially just defeated Mantis, right? He's also given another name in this copy of the film. He's just beaten this adversary and is about to face his final nemesis. And let's see what happens here. So watch very closely.
Hakim! 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 Hakim!
Glad you could finally make it, Billy.
When you watch closely, the camera tricks don't really do it. And we have this intercutting between actual footage of Bruce Lee, right? This is some of the last footage he shot when he was alive. And so we have the man himself doing his characteristic gestures. But then we also have kind of overdubbed other people's sounds, and we have the body double. And the transition is anything but seamless, right? And I probably looked pretty crude even then. And so it kind of begs the question of like, what is going on here? Like, what is the appeal? Because, from one hand, you could say, okay, well, he's not the inimitable Bruce Lee. Like somebody is imitating him, right? But then again, you see the difference between the two performance styles, and it suggests that this copy is nowhere near as good as the authenticity. So conversely, it could end up just reifying what makes Bruce Lee impossible to imitate, as much as we all like to do it as kind of our hobby. So this is, I mentioned this in the body double thing, partly because Kung Fu is sometimes talked about as a body genre of film. Pornography is also a body genre, right? Where what matters in these films is what is happening with bodies and what bodies can do and their potential and the like. And so in films like Enter the Dragon, we even have kind of a convergence, right? We have these like semi-pornographic scenes included, but we have this kind of extreme bodily performance going on here. And this is one of the reasons that I think that Kung Fu films and martial arts films are talked about as being genre films, and ones that even sometimes verge into the exploitation mode, right? Where you have, if you're interested in sex, you get a lot of sex. If you're interested in a particular type of iconography, Gothic or something like that, or Nazi films, that is what you get. And the whole film is about like fulfilling that need. And so Quentin Tarantino is someone who like recycles a lot of these exploitation tropes in his films. Out of exploitation, you have other types of more specific terms like blaxploitation, right? And so films like Shaft, right, a kind of crime detective film, Superfly, right, the pimp film, right, and a lot of sex. But one of the politics of the blaxploitation films is the casting, right? That this is identifying African American communities as a market that needs to be fulfilled and wants to see African American actors on screen. And so part of what distinguishes them is the casting politics. And I've already talked a little bit about what was going on in the US and geopolitics, right, with the Vietnam War and the civil unrest. And so you have, big-breasted babes with guns who are going to like fight back, right? These bad chicks, or, this is for all the brothers and sisters who have had enough of the man, right? And we are going to fight back against the man. So we often have these lone heroes doing this, or maybe the whole Black community fighting back. So there's kind of militarized edge to some of this. We're often packing heat. And and this is relevant to the Bruce Lee films, partly because you do get African American characters. And I mentioned the Mantis or Hakim character in Game of Death. I think Williams is even more significant in Enter the Dragon, right? He has fantastic screen presence here, and he is established very early on as an underdog of color. So for example, when he arrives in Hong Kong to go to this martial arts competition, he arrives and discovers that ghettos are the same all over the world. They stink, right? So he even utters this feeling of like, Black people's ghettos and yellow people's ghettos are the same. Like we are both the underclass here, right? We are both underdogs. And so someone's got to fight for us. And there's even a flashback scene in Enter the Dragon that shows how essentially what Williams's reality is back in the United States. And so I want to show a clip here where he remembers this incident that happened when he was trying to leave for Hong Kong to join this competition.
Oh!
are you? Hey, this Jig's got a passport.
Where you going, Jig? Where's the plane ticket for?
Hong Kong. By Hawaii.
He's not going to Hawaii.
Well, look what we got here! Calling a police officer!
Right, and hands up everyone who doesn't want to throw those police officers to the dogs. I don't think I see any hands. So, but in that scene, I think it's interesting and it's depressing because police brutality is still with us in a horribly contemporary way. So this is not ancient history by any means, but this is a film in 1973 that is already showing essentially black dojos, martial arts institutes, right, with the African Cobra as being a reality and like an established reality. That class is full of people preparing to defend themselves, and we are immediately shown why they need to defend themselves. So this is, again, I think representing a type of fandom and a type of emergent culture that didn't happen like after Bruce Lee was done. This has already been taken up, right? This is already mainstream. So Williams, the actor who plays him, Jim Kelly, went on immediately the next year to make Black Belt Jones. And then several years later, around the time of Game of Death, Black Belt Jones 2, also known as the Tattoo Connection. Why is it the Tattoo Connection? Because one of Bruce Lee's films was called The Chinese Connection, which again was, I think, trying to capitalize on the popularity of a different connection film. And he had this kind of moment of stardom as well as being a Black or African-American Kung Fu icon, right? Posing with Muhammad Ali, right? The greatest, right? So we have the two types of the greatest here next to each other, and you have the cult of the body and all that stuff. You have, the iconography of even the advertisements for the Tattoo Connection imitating Enter the Dragon, so on and so forth. Let's take a quick look at Black Belt Jones. Not a great film. I can't really recommend it, but I think it's interesting to look at. Not many people have seen it nowadays. Let's just look at the opening sequence, see how they bring us in and introduce the title character. So I totally agree with what Brodus said. It is all about that soundtrack. It's like you want to get up and dance right away. Even though, and I feel like just from that clip, we just cut straight to the chase. It's like, we're just going to start kicking some butt in the first scene. Like, who cares about plot? Let's just start fighting now. It like leaps over the car. So dramatic entrance. Although there's other stuff like the stunts look a little bit lame. I bet that car door opening thing looked lame even back in 1974. And I feel like in a lot of Bruce Lee films too, some of these henchman characters aren't really, worthy opponents of Bruce Lee. But, seeing this again and again, it's almost like they don't seem to really matter that much. They are pretty disposable. And as long as you keep the camera focused on the hero, and there's funny moments in there too, like, what, you're really going to shoot him in the back? Oh, you shot him in the butt. Okay, that's funny. That's cool. So we're having a good time. There's this little campiness involved here too. Same director as did Enter the Dragon, right? So there's a continuum between like the Kung Fu flick and the kind of blaxploitation flick. They come together in a bunch of different films. And this was not a standalone thing, nor was Jim Kelly the only Black Dragon, right? You had Ron Van Cleef billing himself as a Black Dragon and appearing in Hong Kong productions. So like Hong Kong studios conscripting him to be the star, right? And then going on to make The Way of the Black Dragon, right? And a lot of later pieces, right? So some in Hong Kong, some in Hollywood. So it's 1970s moment. It really expanded quite significantly. 1974, you also have it kind of percolating into other parts of American popular culture, Saturday morning cartoons, right? Hong Kong Phooey, our wonder underdog here. But eventually, right, Kung Phooey, right? We're now 2003, so decades later. And even in the early 21st century, we have this kind of African-American Bruce Lee superfan being represented in this highly parodic, farcical film that's making fun of all of those Asian and Asian American stereotypes and all of the like Kung Fu schlock that you get. But we have this character named Leroy who changes his name to Roy Lee so he can be more like Bruce Lee. And this is a very interesting film. Let's watch a clip from Kung Fu. This is our last clip of the evening. And let me know if you recognize where this film was shot.
Okay, now Roy, he's a guest, okay? So none of your Kung Fu crap. Oh! I mean it. God, this should be normal for 5 minutes?
Okay, 5 minutes.
Hey, he's a monk, right? That must be him.
Yeah. Excuse me, brother.
Shirley Temple? Are you from Shirley Temple?
I am from Shirley Temple.
Oh, hey, I'm Wayman. And this is Roy.
Roy Lee. Ni hao.
Ni hao.
Honored to meet you.
Art Chu.
Bless you.
No, my name is Art Chu.
Oh, his name's Art Chu.
Raymond?
Wayman.
Roy Lee.
Well, his name's really Leroy, but he thinks he's Chinese.
Hey. Maybe he's here to show us Chinese boxing.
Chinese boxing?
Yeah, you know. Fist of Fury, Chinese Connection. Enter the Dragon.
You have to excuse Roy. He doesn't get enough fiber in his diet.
That's it. Bruce Lee, the king.
25 years ago.
Right, so you get a sense from just this scene of the encounter between the African-American Bruce Lee fan, right, with his buddy, the Asian American, right, probably San Francisco born and raised, with his relative coming from China, right? He's coming here and maybe he'll teach us authentic Chinese boxing. But by this point, it's kind of a degraded stereotype, or it's like so shop worn that we're bringing it back for a final laugh, it seems. So it shows, again, that we've gone through like several cycles of this initial discovery, many recyclings, and then finally the parodic take on it. And this is, I think, partly a result of the so-called Bruceploitation. So we talked about exploitation, blaxploitation, sexploitation. Well, there's so much Bruce stuff out there that you have not Bruce Lee, but Bruce Ree with Ron Van Cleef, and then many others, Bruce Le, Bruce Lay, Bruce Lai, Bruce Lay, Brute Lee, right? Bruce Lee was a fighter. Brute Lee is a merciless killer. And then Bruce Lee, it's almost like they're expecting people at the video store not to look very closely. Myron Bruce Lee, is like, how would you not identify that? But clearly there's a market for this type of stuff, right? There's a market for fine dining and there's a market for fast food takeout. And I think that this is not just to be scoffed at. I think it is part of what props up the legend. It's like the Bruce Lee legend is kind of floating on this sea of other text that he inspired. And, to choose a Bruce Lee superfan who I very much admire, Stephen Chow, right? A fantastic filmmaker and comedian who is, again, like bringing back the Bruce Lee look and feel in films like Shaolin Soccer, or we have The Game of Death costume, or Kung Fu Hustle, where he himself strikes a Bruce Lee pose, right? And emerges from the chrysalis to become a Kung Fu master. And then, of course, many of my students at UBC haven't watched any Bruce Lee films, but they sure have watched the Ip Man films, right? And this is the Chinese boxing that they know, right? Ip Man, or Ye Wen, being Bruce Lee's teacher, martial arts teacher in Hong Kong. And so we got Bruce Lee films first, now we have Ip Man films. And look at that combined box office from just the first 4 Ip Man films, right? This is huge. We're talking $500 million almost. And so it's going to keep going, right? We've got a franchise in the works. There was a Mulan film released earlier this year, and I was paying attention to it partly because I translated a 1939 Mulan film. You can compare the two online if you want. But the Mulan film from 1998 was a lot of people's touchstone. What the heck does it have to do with Bruce Lee? It actually has a lot to do with Bruce Lee. One of the most popular characters in it is a little dragon, a Xiaolong, known as Mushu. And Li Xiaolong, right, Bruce Lee's Chinese name, Li, little dragon. Well, we have a little dragon here, and I don't think it's an accident. Or, interestingly, the voice actor who they brought in was Eddie Murphy, right, who had been a Bruce Lee fan for a long time. And you hear it in his comedy shows, back to Saturday Night Live. So we, again, have this interesting way that Bruce Lee is in the culture, sometimes in very subliminal ways. So this is just a few ways you can kind of connect the dots to the emergence of this legend. And again, how the legend is propped up in big ways and small. So thank you very much for listening. I think that's enough for me for right now to get things rolling. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. These are some of the films that I mentioned just now. So if you ever want to look them up, I think most of them are worth a watch. So thank you again very much for listening to a few of my thoughts on kind of how Bruce Lee came to be the legend he is today, and particularly the contribution of African Americans in kind of perpetuating the legend and allowing Kung Fu culture to flourish on screen. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher.
Yeah, Morgan will mediate the Q&A. Is that right?
Absolutely. So we have a question in from the chat from Calvin. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm absolutely enjoying it. I'm interested in the connection between Kung Fu and comedy. I'm curious why Kung Fu evolved to become Kung Fu comedy. Do you have any thoughts about this cinematic evolution?
I think it's interesting. I once did a talk with a scholar from University of South Carolina called The Ancient Art of Falling Down. And we were looking at some connections between early Chinese screen comedy and early Hollywood kind of vaudeville comedy. And I think one of the connections between them is these kind of pratfalls and gags and bodily gags, right? Buster Keaton gags. There seems to be a kind of continuum, and that a lot of the slapstick performers and the kung fu performers, they're both involved in body genres, and they're both masters of physical performance. It's acrobatic in some ways. And so I think maybe when they're doing fight choreography, and they're like, Jackie Chan is especially famous for this. They see the potential in the use of props and the use of sets to create unexpected things. So an unexpected victory, an unexpected way to land the blow on your opponent that can also be funny. And so this is something that seems to have especially emerged since the mid to late 1970s and become wildly popular. So I'd say that would be the connection that I see in this kind of shared acrobatic possibility.
Thank you. We have another question in now. 2 questions. 1, can you comment on the connection between Chinese nationalism and Bruce Lee's films? I'm thinking of the notion of self-cultivation in martial arts.
Sure. I think in the Bruce Lee films and also in the Ip Man films, some of them are set against, say, the Japanese occupation of China, right? And there's representation of suffering and showing that it's very difficult to fight against the guns of the Japanese, right? They just have superior firepower. And so this is a problem if you're fighting with your fists or with nunchucks. But you have this kind of defiant streak and a certain type of superiority that's not relying on the prosthetics of weapons, which give an unfair advantage, essentially. And I think that, I think Fist of Fury is probably the best example, right, where his master is mocked, right, and he himself is mocked, right? He's a Japanese person played by a Chinese actor, says, well, if you pretend to be a dog, I'll take you into this park that bans dogs and Chinese people, right? So I want to humiliate you. And so one of the things that Bruce Lee does again, is like vanquish the shame and humiliation of Chinese people in very theatrical ways. So that's this huge gesture, which could be interpreted as nationalistic or kind of ethno-nationalistic. But I think it's also rather complex since he was kind of American and Chinese, and also it was British Hong Kong, which is not quite the same as the People's Republic of China. And so Bruce Lee character is not exactly located at the Chinese metropole, so to speak, right? He's not in Beijing, right? And so the lineage is a bit different. And I think that's one reason that some viewers from mainland China who watch Bruce Lee films feel a little bit ambivalent, or at least has expressed to me some ambivalence about Bruce Lee. Like they both admire him as a performer. They recognize his contributions to cinema and martial arts cinema in particular. They appreciate him speaking as a Chinese. But then again, he's not exactly from China in the same way. So I think this is one of the reasons that he hasn't been like fully embraced in China in quite the way that his fandom has taken off in Hong Kong and the United States. But again, that's a rather sweeping statement. I think he has gotten a lot of traction.
Okay, thank you. And a second part, this is from Renren. Do you find there is an irrevocable decline in real martial arts actors today with the rise of post-produced digital effects and contemporary fantasies with magical themes?
Yeah, right. Since The Matrix especially, right? At least for me, that was a huge turning point where you both have Yuen Woo-ping, right, a famous choreographer coming out of the Hong Kong tradition, showing, working with Hollywood studios and choreographing fight scenes, but they're all digitally enhanced. And since then, we've seen so much of that stuff, and it gets a little bit tiring. It's kind of cool at the beginning, and it becomes very video game-like, right? And video game producers, right, as a bigger industry than cinema, as video games, have become masters at the kind of simulated reality. And they have, I think, helped to develop that market. So there has been a huge change in the market that is kind of moving away from the Bruce Lee model of authentic fighting. So it's almost like the market has fragmented, and maybe a lot of cinema is indeed going more towards the video game look and feel and highly post-produced. Whereas if you want to see real fighting, you turn on your television and watch pay-per-view. So I would say that is probably the general trend, but I'd be curious to know what other people's viewing experiences are, because I don't watch a lot of television, and I'm selective about movies. So I haven't watched as much action in recent years. But some of the contemporary films that I have seen, both coming out of China and Hollywood and elsewhere, have been very special effects laden. And to me, that's a different ethos. It's a different appeal than the Bruce Lee appeal.
Great, thank you. Another question from Jamara. Did Bruce Lee follow the values of equality, anti-racism, and discipline that he portrayed in his films?
So this is a question about Bruce Lee, the man, kind of the off-screen man. I have no idea, but certainly his family insists that, and a lot of the people who know him do say that. And one of the things that they point to is that in the martial arts schools that he founded in both Seattle and in Oakland, right, many of his students were African American or Caucasian. They were not, maybe Asians or Asian Americans were in a minority. And so, and in some of the interviews that you can still see today, and some excerpts of them are represented in that documentary I mentioned, he does espouse, he said, this is not just a Chinese thing, right? This is a human thing. And so martial arts is open to everyone. So it does seem like he had a kind of anti-racist, very egalitarian ethos to him, and that the self-cultivation was not just a Chinese thing. That self-cultivation is something that anyone can do if they have the self-discipline.
All right. So a question from Calvin. Can you see Kung Fu Panda as learned from Bruce Lee? If so, how?
I think Kung Fu Panda is a really, really interesting film. It was popular in the US and in English-speaking markets. It was also very, very profitable in China. A lot of people in China felt like it did homage to the culture, got a lot of things right. I haven't made a study of its reception in China. I think that would be very, very interesting. But one of the things that jumped out at me, right, we have, I think, Jack Black voicing Po, the Kung Fu Panda. And right from the beginning, he is like the narrator, right? Legend tells of a legendary warrior whose Kung Fu skills were the stuff of legend. And then he's like playing with action figures right at the beginning. And it's like his own fantasy world. And so we begin with fandom. Like we begin with Jack Black, like your schlubby American, panda-shaped American, as like the protagonist of this film. And he can be transformed into a martial arts master. And it is kind of an American ethos, or at least a mythologized American ethos of the self-made man or the self-made person, right? And if you just try hard enough, right? Or you can exceed expectations, or you can fail and then fail your way to success eventually and respect. So I do think that there is plenty of Bruce Lee that you could find in Kung Fu Panda in terms of the sense of the fan culture surrounding Bruce Lee as well. And that maybe it begins with just playing with action figures. Then maybe you do the shrieks and yells in front of the mirror, but you could eventually, realize the dream. And so I think that type of fantasy emulation is very, very closely tied to what Bruce Lee helped establish.
Thank you. So another question. Thank you so much for your fascinating lecture. I wonder how you interpret Bruce Lee's claims of majoring in philosophy. His explanation of water being the most invincible matter left me with a great impression. Was that some sort of self-fashioning strategy to claim his mastery of Kung Fu, or maybe to charm the Westerners with some Chinese philosophy?
I think that, well, first of all, I'm not a Bruce Lee scholar necessarily. There are actual Bruce Lee scholars out there who have written books and books about him. And so I am partly relying on their scholarship. And what they tell me is that they have read what he left behind, and that it's not particularly original stuff, but does that matter? And it may not, but he did focus on some ideas, and certainly like the be like water, my friend, that notion of fluidity was very important and even central. So I don't think his notebooks that he left behind, I think, are very fragmentary, and he copied down a lot of passages verbatim, maybe without quotation marks, right? So there's a little plagiarism in there. But again, other people's ideas can become your own ideas, and you can try to inhabit them and project them as much as you want. But I do think there's absolutely, in terms of the legend and the myth and the kind of Bruce Lee that is told to us, there is a lot of packaging going on here as well, and ascribing of philosophical profundity and ascribing of wisdom. That this is kind of part of the package that maybe we've been conditioned to want. So I take it all with a grain of salt myself, but that is just kind of my gut reaction to what I've read and watched of Bruce Lee and the people that tell stories about him.
Thank you. I have a question from the chat. Have you watched Afro Samurai? If so, what did you think of it? Also, can you speak to RZA and the Wu-Tang?
No, in a word, no, I have not watched Afro Samurai, right? And there's also like Ghost Dog, and there's a lot out there, but I'm not familiar with that one in particular. And Wu-Tang Clan, like 72 Chambers of Shaolin, I only have a very passing familiarity with. I'm not really an expert, but yeah, I like, rap and hip hop culture. It's like, there's like a Kung Fu element to that as well. And I think that, some of the posing, the strutting, the kind of focus on self-presentation, and this sense of like, there's menace out there, there are adversaries out there. And so you have to project a really strong image that kind of helps. And, adding in a little mysticism as well doesn't hurt. But yeah, Wu-Tang Clan, definitely, you can draw a straight line from the film, and they wanted to incorporate that into their self-image. I'll check out the film though.
So we have another question from Alfred. Did Bruce Lee ever try to cultivate the spiritual and philosophical side of the martial arts?
I think I'm again going to give a kind of I don't know response if you're asking about Bruce Lee, the man, because again, we don't have a lot that we can do to access his actual life. All that we have is the testimony really of his family members and the people who knew him personally. And there are quite a lot. And they do all testify that, this was someone who was had tremendous self-confidence, very ambitious, very original, and really wanted to innovate on screen and, in his presentation. And again, I would check out Way of the Dragon to see how it doesn't exactly fit any model that came before it in terms of the types of scenes that it has, in terms of the characterization and the like, right? That is one of the films in which he famously actually kisses someone on screen. It's like, shocking, right? Breaking the mold. But again, like, I don't know as much about his personal life. And so today I'm mostly kind of talking about how other people have responded to Bruce Lee, and trying to think about why, both the contextual factors and the things that we can see in the films themselves that obviously resonate, and how the films themselves also start to bring in fan culture as well, where you have fans cast as actors in Bruce Lee films, all the way to Kung Fu Panda.
So we have another comment from Vince. Very fascinating perspective. I loved the talk. I think the appeal of Bruce Lee is the harmony of outer strength and the discipline of inner strength, something people were looking for in a hero when Lee's films were released. Wondering how you feel about Lee's portrayal in more modern representation, his humanization in Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, to more recently his cocky representation in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, or his recklessness in Ip Man 4. How do you feel this affects his legend?
It's I think that we're getting, yes, indeed, multiple takes on Bruce Lee, and we are getting multiple perspectives that emphasize one side of his personality versus another. What the actual reality is, again, it's very hard to know for sure, or why the filmmakers would choose to represent him that way or another. I could understand how, like in Ip Man, it would make a lot of sense to have an unruly apprentice that the master Ip Man has to tame. Otherwise, like, what is Ip Man going to do? It's not like Bruce Lee came to him fully formed as a martial arts expert, and Ip Man just kind of blessed him and sent him on his way, right? This is someone who has a lot of potential, but he has to be molded. He has to be sculpted into that piece of jade or whatever it is. And so I think that for contemporary viewers, again, I'm struck again and again how few Bruce Lee films a lot of people have seen. And so this may be just the beginning of their Bruce Lee journey, that first they watch Ip Man, and then they are drawn into the archival stuff. And then they go back to the earlier films. And then that may change their opinions. But that would be my main guess. Is that, and people watching, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, have probably watched a couple Bruce Lee films in the past. Most of the representations that I've seen of him have been sympathetic. They haven't been in kind of the expose mode. But I'm sure we'll get more representations of him as being a flawed individual. And we also have to take into account that, right, there is kind of a Bruce Lee Foundation run by his daughter out there that does help to shape the legend, and is trying very much to control the narrative, even as you have all these disparate fan communities out there doing their own thing.
Another question. I am curious about the relationship between the bodily commitment in Bruce Lee's films and the stereotypical image of Chinese people as the sick man of Asia. Do you think the image of Bruce Lee was born from this type of anxiety of Asian body?
I think, right, we're talking about him, kicking that sign, right, and splitting it apart and using the most kind of violent, personal, bodily way to just demolish that stereotype. And we all cheer from the sidelines while he does this. I do think there's plenty of anxiety there, and there had been a lot of emasculating discourse in American and other popular culture, representing Chinese men as effeminate or not, not as vigorous and virile as bulky white men or something like that, or African American men, right? So I think Bruce Lee did help a lot to demolish or kind of rebut that stereotype. And it's been pointed out that, again, the kind of Jackie Chan, Chris Tucker connection, or like why you often get these pairings. And this is kind of a context related to these body politics, is proximity, in that Chinatown or kind of Chinese American communities and African American communities often were very closely related. Like there was actually a lot of kind of daily intercourse and like discussion and interaction between these different communities in America that I think helped to create a mutual regard and create a sense of community. And so I think this helped to play into this feeling of we're both kind of vulnerable populations, but not just our lives matter, but in our bodies matter. And so Bruce Lee was, again, only 135 pounds, but he seemed larger than life. And so again, if someone that small can be that powerful, then so can I. So, and so can any Chinese person or any person of any race.
Do you think if Bruce Lee's success in the 1970s United States was somehow echoing the promotion of physical strength and heroism in American culture, what appealed to the American audience in the beginning of Bruce Lee's legend?
And again, I'm not sure if all Americans respond to Bruce Lee in the same way, but he had an enthusiastic following, and then you had real keeners who turned into kind of a cult phenomenon as well, and they want to consume every single martial arts thing out there, right? You have karate schools starting up. The Japanese economy is on the rise, but also this feeling of that there are kind of deep Chinese roots to Bruce Lee, and that there is some kind of philosophical foundation, but that he's a character who brings together the best of the United States in this kind of go-getter, very ambitious, very self-confident, not afraid to put himself out there type of ethos, with a distinctively Chinese art form of martial arts. So that he is kind of a hybrid figure, or he's a crossover figure that people really, really respect. So I think that in the 1970s, and the US was not in a great place economically. And there was, and even into the Reagan years, right? There was a lot of poverty. There was a lot of socioeconomic factors that may have contributed to a lower sense of cultural confidence than you had in the post-war boom years, right? 50s into the early 60s, right? You have a lot of rapid growth. Everybody's doing well, or so it seems on the surface. But then a lot of the discontent came out after the assassinations in 1968. And then like the 70s, it seemed like we were in kind of a funk, in a decline. And so then we have popular culture kind of trying to fill in a vacuum, into a gap. And so I do think that the heroism of Bruce Lee, this is kind of a circuitous way of answering your question, but I do think the heroism of Bruce Lee resonated with people from many walks of life in the US who were looking for a hero, who were looking for an underdog hero in particular. It definitely got some mojo there, right? And you heard, like, even in the Black Belt Jones opening, the music, right? The music, you find that music in many genres of film. And this was kind of like the sound of the age. And so this is making all of these films cool, right? I don't know how much input Bruce Lee had onto the soundtrack of Enter the Dragon. I'd be very curious to know if he had any influence. But, right, this is like, you can think of martial arts as being like dancing, right? There's this kind of rhythmic movement and the like. And so there's this wonderful bringing together of, music culture and screen culture, and then actual physical, popular culture.
So we have one final question. Would you say this idea of fluidity came from Taoism? And there's a second part to the question, which is, can you comment on the difference between the martial art form portrayed by Jin Yong, the Wuxia novelist, and the martial art form portrayed by Bruce Lee?
Let me just answer the second question. I think the first one, I don't have a great answer for, But I mean, for Jin Yong, right, or Louis Cha, we actually have a Louis Cha endowed chair in Chinese studies at UBC, right? So we're all martial arts heroes at UBC. But Jin Yong was a novelist. He was a newspaper man, and he wanted to increase circulation for his newspapers, and so he started writing these serialized martial arts novels. This is 1950s Hong Kong, and Hong Kong had a huge number of migrants coming in from China after the Civil War. It's still kind of getting on its feet and working to absorb them after all the devastation wreaked by the Japanese. You also have a lot of talent coming into publishing and filmmaking and the like. And so the kind of 50s, 60s takeoff in Hong Kong popular culture, including in the newspapers, is part of that demographic shift. And so Jin Yong he had a journalistic career in the past. The man could really write. He was also a history buff. He had a legal background as well. And so he wrote a lot of these novels set in China's imperial past, often the Qing dynasty or earlier. But his martial arts heroes, he has these descriptions of extended fight scenes, and his novels have been, adapted for TV, adapted for movies, adapted into video games and the like. But it's a cast of thousands. And in some Lu Dingji, right, the Deer in the Cauldron, you may have a central character. But in a lot of them, it's a bit more dispersed. And so you don't have the same concentration of narrative energy focused on one person. And of course, we can't really see these people. And so you don't have the physical presence that Bruce Lee has. And so I think that he created not a look, but definitely a feel, right, and an aura. And there's some mysticization, there is some kind of pseudo-history going on, or we have, historical fiction going on. But you don't have that central Bruce Lee character for the most part, who has the charisma and again, has the physical bodily presence that is showing that he's a